Yo, hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome back to this Nebulous Live Development Creation Series. I looked at my YouTube post history, and what do you know? It's been 7 days since I posted a video. And those 7 days just blew by. I didn't even realize, it didn't even feel like that much time had gone by. I hadn't done any recordings. I had been working on some stuff during that time, but after feeling a week go by without sticking to my recording methodology, I definitely feel like I missed an opportunity to a certain extent to get a lot more done. So I feel like it's a good idea for me to get back into this rhythm of doing these recordings because they help me focus. And it's going to help with dealing with some of these problems I'm trying to solve. Some of the things I've been working on, I picked up some Cinemachine skills to help with some of the camera movement, some of the camera repositioning and transitioning. It's got some nuance, but it's actually, the fundamentals are pretty straightforward, so I think I can figure that out. I was doing some work to change how the suns work so they emit light differently and are sized more rationally for a sun. I've got to work that into the spawning system, but that's a little bit better. I have to fix some things with how the lighting works, though, since I'm not getting the results I want at the moment. I was also starting to consider how to do the background stars as a skybox. So like right now I've got the skybox, but this thing is static. Even though it works as a skybox, it's a placeholder. The idea is that whenever the galaxy generates, it would be cool if like the actual stars the player could go to were shown up on the skybox. So as a scan goes out, if a scan like hits the closest star as this one or something, it would like actually reveal the star. And that gives a signature to scan down further and then send ships to, basically. But that's a pretty in-depth problem for making the skybox accurate in that regard every time like the system changes. So that was also something I was considering pretty hard. But now I've really got to just dive in and do some real work on the game. I've been kind of just thinking about the game a lot, but I haven't done any real, for the most part, I haven't really put any real effort in for like a week. A little bit here and there, but nothing like I was doing at the beginning of this series and up to last week where I was still putting videos out, so I've just got to get back into it. There's not really anything else I can do. I can't deny it. I make more progress when I do these recordings. And I suppose on that note, I might as well get started. I don't think there's anything else I needed to discuss here. I just wanted to apologize for the gap in videos. I am still making this game, and I am still excited about making the game. I ran into some design decisions I had to do, so I took some time to think about it, but I only meant to maybe take like a day or two, and it like swept into 7 days pretty quickly, so I've just got to make sure I get back in the rhythm of making these videos, and I think I will continue to make solid progress. So without any further ado, I'm going to get started here. So there is an issue when I enter play mode, and that is the fact that the spawn worked, but unfortunately the player spawned themselves inside of the sun. So if I close the game view and I check the scene out, essentially what happens is this, I'm actually getting another kind of weird error here, so I might have messed it up, and I'm in the scene view. It's just that it's okay. It's just that the sun's so much larger. So now I've got this thing going on, where as you can see, like, you can even see it ever so slightly. It looks like this might be something there, and there it is. There is something there. So there's a planet there, and then this looks like it's a planet. It didn't select it. This is a planet, and so basically, as you can see, the scale is way better. However, there's this lighting issue. This should be lit up on this side and shadowed on this side, and it's not working correctly. And that's mostly just due to the fact that I'm just not super great with HDRP and global illumination. My my idea was to have the sun use global illumination and have the emission light the surface of this planet. However, maybe because it's screen space or something, it's not working correctly. So I'm not sure exactly how to fix that. It's extremely... there's just so much complexity in the rendering system. But I don't know off the top of my head how to fix it. I really don't. But effectively, I need to, for now, devise a system for some kind of default range from the sun whenever the new system spawns. The other thing is I've got to figure out a way to pick one of the planets as a... see, that one looks like it gets a little bluer. I basically have to make sure that some planet is picked as the player's starting planet. I think last time I was stuck on that because, like, that kind of requires you to pick one of all of the planets. But I don't have a system for generating every single planet yet, so I don't know how to pick that exactly. I could hard-code it in here to act as a starting system to get back to testing. I'm trying to consider how I should do this. The thing that popped into my head was use an action so I can remove the assignment of a random planet. Part of the idea I had was to basically use an entity system, an integer identifier system to get like one gigantic array of ints from 0 to max stars, and each of those represents one of the stars, and then just like pick a random star, and then within that, like check if it has a planet, and if it does have a planet, make that the starting planet, basically. And that would help with some other systems also, so I've got to consider that. However, that's reinventing the wheel a little bit, since Unity's going to be coming out with an ECS upgrade soon, in which case I could just use that to do entities. Man. So yeah, this is why I was struggling with this, because there's just a lot of support systems bleeding together here in terms of picking the starting system during galaxy generation, which means I need to have the galaxy generation figured out. Which means I'm going to need to have, like, the distant stars figured out somehow. And then they're going to have to be scannable as well. And try throwing stuff together, I guess. I'm also debating yanking the star cluster and instead just having nebula full of star systems and then have the galaxy be made up of nebulas. Nebulas and perhaps spaces between nebulas where there is more empty space. Let's see. Okay, so now I'm debating on if I should I guess there's an active star system component. I'm sorry, I'm just getting really hung up on doing this well. Just because criticism runs quite deeply in the community, or at least it can for the right people. Okay, so basically, whenever the man, I'm just stumped. It's easy enough to come in here and just add the capital planet, but if I'm generating multiple systems, I have to... I understand I could just generate all the systems and have a random value and check that random value every time, and eventually, if the random value produces a result, or I guess I could do the other way and say, if home planet is selected as a Boolean, then check the random to get a result, and then in the event that there is a result, you set the home planet, and then you set the home planet chosen to true, basically. However, what that does is that adds a bool check for every single system, and you only need it to happen one time. So another thing I was considering is if I do the entity thing, more or less, you just do a random range from int to int of from 0 to whatever the star count, maximum star count is, and it'll just pick one of those. And then once it picks one, that becomes the home system. As long as there's a proper planet type in the system. And if there is a proper planet type, basically, then it's just, you don't have to do that check, the bool check for every single star. You just do you just pick one random pass, maybe 2 or 3 if there's no particular system, maybe a dozen if it takes a really long time. But most of the systems will have a planet, and it can just pick a planet. Okay, so the only thing I can really consider then it's gotta be like an entity thing. So you would basically have entities for each nebula, entities for each star, and entities for each planet / moon / signature. Which is getting into like thousands upon thousands of entities. And that effectively allows me to not have to have 10,000 game objects to represent those. And instead you can get certain data based off of the entity readouts is kind of what I'm considering. So I'm just going to give something like that a shot here. So let's generate a new mono behavior. And let me figure out where I was at here. And I suppose it would make sense for it to go under galaxy generation. And I suppose this is just going to be called like celestial entities. And I guess we can go from the top down to some degree. So I can come in here and do a mono behavior and say, we'll do like generate nebula entities, basically. And this component will go on our galaxy object. As soon as these scripts compile. And once we have the entity generated, so these might functionally be very similar. This was just generating a hard-coded value. That's for UI. Okay, so we will need a public int for nebula count, and then a public integer array for nebula entity ID. And then on start, we have to say for nebula count, we also have to say, oops, hold on, nebula entity ID equals a new int array of size nebula count. And then from here we've got nebula entity ID at I equals, and it actually is just I. And now what this allows me to do is simply pick an int from this array, and that is more or less represents a nebula. And all of the like supporting values are managed elsewhere, which is kind of why I was considering slapping this array in player data, because player data would allow for these to get passed around and worked against each other differently. So I'm actually going to open that up really quick here. Although I'm actually going to not, I kind of don't want to put it in here because I'm not trying to expose these values to the inspector. So I might as well make a new game object called player entities. And might as well spell it correctly. And this is why it would be really cool to have the ECS version out, because this is basically recreating the wheel with how good the ECS system is, but I think I can pull off one here. So instead I'm going to have a player entities object, and I'm going to have to create a player entities mono behavior. And it's very simply just going to have a public, and I actually don't want to I don't need to expose them right now, but I suppose I could if I wanted to see stability, so let me leave it up for now. Okay, so we've got public nebula entity ID IDs, plural. Oh, whoops, and it's an integer array. We're also going to have public int array star entity IDs. And we'll do celestial entity IDs also for representing the rest of the stuff that can spawn. And there might be more values in here eventually, but for now it's more or less, if I need everything about a nebula, a particular nebula, then essentially if that's like the 7th nebula, I just grab number 7 from here, and then there's a way to like build a struct using a bunch of other arrays that are keyed in to, or more specifically, there's like 3 separate arrays with data values for the nebula. Each of those elements are lined up to match an entity ID. So if I pick the 7th nebula ID, it'll grab the 7th element from each of those 3 arrays, and all 3 of those data values match up to be the nebula's entity IDs. And more or less you can like build a struct from that data that like represents something that you're trying to work with in the nebula, or with the nebula or whatever. And that's going to scale a little better than using like 10,000 game objects is the idea. And it will assist with recreating these objects more dynamically. So instead of having to have 10,000 game objects lying around, I can just have these arrays of ints. And then arrays of other data, specific data. Or something like that. So I'm not going to do it in here. Instead, now I have player entities. So now if I'm generating the nebula entities, I just have to come in here and say public player entities, spell it correctly, of course. And now I have to come down here and simply change these to say player entities dot nebula entity IDs. Yes, okay. And I have technically defined all of the nebula, quote unquote. So if I have like 32 nebula or whatever, this array will fill up. There will more or less need to be vector 3 is generated for each nebula count also. Something like this. But then we have to figure out a way to generate the nebula position. And I had one idea for that, which was to use some kind of algorithm that would essentially use the nebula's integer ID as a seed. And that way, instead of saving every single vector 3 position, I could actually just like plug in the int ID basically. And it would effectively do something like this. And this would allow me to not have to store these vector 3s. Instead, anytime they're required for something, this seed value can, or this like seed generator can more or less just recreate the value. And that's more efficient than storing like 10,000 game objects and all their data. Plus, you might not even need the game object. You literally might just need its position for something. And you don't need to like have the whole game object. So I feel like for the scope of this particular problem I'm trying to solve, it wouldn't hurt to do a system like this, because I just don't think I'm going to be able to spawn 10,000 stars as game objects without using ECS. So I'm still considering maybe jumping onto the beta to use ECS, but wait, I'd really like to wait to see what they update in it. Alright, so how could I reproduce? How could I actually make this happen? Oh, that's not very happy with me for some reason. Oh. Oops, okay. I can type straight. Okay, but how would I actually make this happen? Like, and then more or less the increment is multiplied by the ID. And this produces, based off some kind of math, a result. And since the ID is the same every time, the result here will be equal every time. Which means I can just rebuild the value, which is exactly what I'm trying to do, as opposed to store all the values all the time. So I'm going to have to pack in some kind of man, for some reason I keep like Fibonacci sequences ringing in my head big time. But some of the math for that was ghastly. So I'm getting something else. So you've got the arm count, and then each arm has like a nebula count. And there's like 800 other things that can come into play here, like nebula bounds and stuff. But so we have an arm count and nebula count. And essentially it's like for each arm count, for each nebula. And then you gotta like extend along a curve. And the increment is length of curve divided by just the nebula count. And then from this you've got like what, like 5, maybe you've got like 5 values now along this curve. And ID, it's like, so it's like increment times ID basically. However, this is, okay, so this is like a math thing that I'm not quite familiar with, but if I do like a series, basically, I can like get the curve algorithm to like reset somehow. And I'm not exactly sure how to do that. It's like, okay, so like after the first curve, it has to restart basically, or it has to like switch to a new. Okay, so now I'm getting a kind of a different idea. So there's a max number of nebula, which means that that number can represent a division based off the ID. So the ID has to key in the division. Or, no, the ID is really just trying to recreate. It's just trying to get the position, which is, it's dependent upon a certain nebula within a certain arm. Unless you can figure out a way to like spiral them outwards from the center. However, from this point, I've got to the whole goal here is that the only value or the only variable at play is the ID value. So in that case, if okay, so like, am I supposed to have separate data then? Like, is each arm supposed to have a count or something? Arm.nebula count, do I have to turn this into data? maybe I can have an arm entity. Galactic arm. That's starting to like bleed into different types of galaxies though. Which once again changes the mathematical distributions. More or less just like it also breaks into whether or not the entity actually, man, I'm just really not sure. Like I feel like this should work in theory, but I'm just not sure about the math to make this work. It really makes me just want to freaking try doing this with game objects. I know there's a way to do some kind of math though, where I can, all I have to do is use the ID, and it's as if it's running through a for loop where I is ID and I is just incrementing, but there's no loop. This is just a one-off using the ID as an incrementer. So in that case, if we're looking at nebula count, breaks up into 32 pieces, or something like that. There would have to be an arm count. Or there could just be an arm concept, and I don't have to actually generate arm entities. I can just generate the nebula. And for that, I was kind of considering doing some volumetric fog or something. And just like putting these volumetric fogs next to each other, which could possibly work. I would need to study up on volumetric fog a little bit more. And then inside those volumetric fogs, I could actually have the stars, which from the nebula view would look correct, I suppose. It's kind of the same thing that I'm trying to make sure that like the 10,000 stars or whatever doesn't like break the computer resource caps or whatever. Man, shoot. Alright, so I know that, okay, so the key to this is going to be how do I get the algorithm to discern arms, basically. Because you can't just go from 6 to 7 and extend the length. It has to know that at that number the counter resets, but it like resets in multiple ways, basically. So I'm almost feeling like a switch case. So you do like a switch, and the math inside of it is like nebula count, modulus, and to keep it simple, we can just say like 6, and more or less or we can, I guess maybe instead it's like ID mod 6. And depending on this, we have cases for like more or less 0, which is arm 0, or case 1, which is arm 1, or even start with arm 1 or whatever. And this just represents the arms. And more or less the ID can through this decide which arm it's in. So here we would have a case of if it's in the first arm, then it has like a unique starting position basically. Or they all have a unique start position, but like they actually have a unique ending position. It's like it's the same paternal curve, but it ends in a different place. So I guess I would also wind up needing like a curve function for this. And the curve function actually equals like and it's using like vector 3.0 and then some kind of endpoint. And to determine the endpoint, I've got to like so like for num of arms. And we can say like max arm length. So more or less we'd have like vector 3 dot forward times max arm length. And then like this whole thing has to get quaternion. So then we've got quaternion angle axis, and the angle is the axis will be vector 3 dot up, and the angle will have to be some kind of increment, which is or hold on. So I can basically okay, so this is basically like something like arm endpoints array equals this. And that's like, if we're assuming 6 arms, it's like 0 through 5. And then well, actually, this is going to actually for the initialization this makes sense, but for each point afterwards, I don't want it to have to recalculate the ring points, but I might be able to recalculate one of them. And it's undeniable that I'm probably gonna need some kind of Bezier curve here. And then Bezier curve. I guess it has to have control points. So maybe it just has one control point. And that will create the exact same curve pattern for each arm, the only difference being the endpoint. And I guess we would be looking at what, like an arm endpoint increment, which is something like 360 divided by arm count. And then more or less the angle is arm endpoint increment times something. And it's basically just times I then. And that will produce, in this example, 6 endpoints. And the Bezier curve gets basically B30 equals start point. And then it gets some kind of arbitrary control point. And then the endpoint just equals arm endpoint at I. Arm endpoints at I. Which more specifically is almost acting like it's going to be some kind of int. Or like ID selector, which is like more or less ID mod 6. And in this instance, ID mod 6 is going to pick between, or it's always going to be between what, 0 and 5, which is exactly what we want here. And effectively, I don't have to do a for loop to determine each of these curves. I can just call this function multiple times, and the control point can be constant. The start point is more or less constant. The endpoint is selected per ID selector. And then there has to be like a resolution of the curve. Which in this instance is just like 6. And then you just have to run the I guess the curve resolution is 6. But once again, the ID selector actually helps select which arm it's in. And then you just pick like okay, so if like the ID is 25 and you mod by 6, you effectively get the number 1. Which actually isn't correct, is it? I almost want to just, actually what I want to do this is divide by 6, don't I? So in this instance, if the ID is like 25 and it divides by 6, then you're looking at 4. So it's the 4th arm. And then for the curve resolution, you're looking at ID. Or no, curve resolution 6 makes sense, but for selecting the nebula, now you're looking at the modulus. Nebula position ID maybe, and that is essentially, that's the ID modded by 6. So by doing this, we can select into an arm based off ID, and we can pick the position within the ID. And then that position is more or less down here. It's just like the third position of the curve, basically. So I feel like it got built above, so I'm not going to do this. Instead, it's going to be like a new vector 3 at and then like I've got to somehow use the curve here. So like the curve function needs to, I guess like down here it's essentially saying like, and I'm actually not sure I need the switch case anymore. Now that I can use the nebula position arm selector ID thing to work out which increment we're on. But the curve function needs to like basically take in the Bezier curve and then it just has to pick like nebula position ID it just has to do point at nebula position ID. So it's as if it's like as if there's an f of x equals some Bezier curve. And then from here you say f of basically nebula position ID. Equals some Bezier curve at nebula position ID basically. And whatever the Bezier function just happens to be is going to exactly give the correct number. And this will allow me to, anytime it's necessary, basically recreate the exact same position without having to store all of them. So in startup, the game can generate the objects, but it probably won't since the player's starting in starting in a system. I'm going to have to remember how to do Bezier curves. The main part I can't remember how to do is the resolution. I can't exactly remember how to do this part. Picking one point on the curve. I know there's a way to do it, but I can't remember exactly. I might have to study that pretty hard. Okay, so I think a lot of this is pretty straightforward. The main thing is just I'm going to have to study Bezier curves. I also might be able to use like a curve object in the inspector. So let me see real quick. Like an animation. Let me see what kind of curves we've got. I think animation curve is the only one. Okay, so in here I can effectively just generate one. I don't have to think about it. And that might be okay. And I know I can come in here and basically create my own control points, if I'm not mistaken. So if I need to, you know, change it up a little bit, I can just come in here and like tweak how the curve looks. And just try something like this. I'm gonna have to play around with that. But effectively that becomes this curve. And then all I have to do is like work in like this part and then make the increment different in that regard as well. And I think more or less I can generate a position, a proper position. Alright, so that's it for this video. I'm sorry. This is probably one of the hardest engineering problems about this game, outside of having a ton of ships and like just rendering stuff in general. Making it to where the galaxy spawns efficiently is a pretty tough problem compared to a lot of the other ones I've worked on so far. So it's gonna take a lot more thinking and studying to get it right. But like No Man's Sky has 18 quintillion stars in their galaxy, so I'm pretty sure I can pull off like a couple thousand. Or, excuse me, that game has 18 quintillion planets, I think. I don't know if it has 18 quintillion stars, but it's up in that range. It's gigantic. So I know there's a way to like make a couple thousand stars. So when I come back in the next video, I'm very likely for some reason I want to try yanking or ignoring the entity approach and just shotgun blasting it with game objects and just see where it breaks. See if it breaks at 100 objects or 1,000, or maybe it breaks at like 10,000 objects. And from there, see if I can actually pull this off without building up extra custom systems, more or less. And that would work with the Unity system and not build extra stuff around it. So I'm gonna call it there for this video. And I apologize that it wasn't more interesting. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.